Chapter 5, Part 3 of Queen Victoria. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Queen Victoria by Giles Lytton Strachey. Chapter 5, Part 3. 3. The Prince's triumph was short-lived. A few weeks later, owing to Palmerston's influence, the government was defeated in the House, and Lord John resigned. Then, after a short interval, a coalition between the Whigs and the followers of Peel came into power, under the premiership of Lord Aberdeen. Once more, Palmerston was in the Cabinet. It was true that he did not return to the Foreign Office. That was something to the good. In the Home Department it might be hoped that his activities would be less dangerous and disagreeable. But the Foreign Secretary was no longer the complacent Granville, and in Lord Clarendon the Prince knew that he had a minister to deal with, who, discreet and courteous as he was, had a mind of his own. These changes, however, were merely the preliminaries of a far more serious development. Events on every side were moving towards a catastrophe. Suddenly the nation found itself under the awful shadow of imminent war. For several months, amid the shifting mysteries of diplomacy and the perplexed agitations of politics, the issue grew more doubtful and more dark, while the national temper was strained to the breaking point. At the very crisis of the long and ominous negotiations, it was announced that Lord Palmerston had resigned. Then the pent-up fury of the people burst forth. They had felt that in the terrible complexity of events they were being guided by weak and embarrassed counsels, but they had been reassured by the knowledge that at the centre of power there was one man, with strength, with courage, with determination, in whom they could put their trust. They now learnt that that man was no longer among their leaders. Why? In their rage, anxiety, and nervous exhaustion, they looked round desperately for some hidden and horrible explanation of what had occurred. They suspected plots. They smelt treachery in the air. It was easy to guess the object upon which their frenzy would vent itself. Was there not a foreigner in the highest of high places, a foreigner whose hostility to their own adored champion was unrelenting and unconcealed? The moment that Palmerston's resignation was known, there was a universal outcry, and an extraordinary tempest of anger and hatred burst with unparalleled violence upon the head of the Prince. It was everywhere asserted and believed that the Queen's husband was a traitor to the country, that he was a tool of the Russian court, that in obedience to Russian influences he had forced Palmerston out of the government, and that he was directing the foreign policy of England in the interests of England's enemies. For many weeks these accusations filled the whole of the press. Repeated at public meetings, elaborated in private talk, they flew over the country, growing every moment more extreme and more improbable. While respectable newspapers thundered out their grave invectives, halfpenny broadsides hawked through the streets of London re-echoed in doggerel vulgarity the same sentiments and the same suspicions. Note: the Turkish war both far and near has played the very deuce then, and little Al, the royal pal, they say has turned a Russian. Old Aberdeen, as may be seen, looks woeful pale and yellow, and old John Bull had his belly full of dirty Russian tallow. Chorus: we'll send him home and make him groan. Oh, Al, you've played the deuce then. The German lad has acted sad and turned tail with the Russians. Last Monday night, all in a fright, Al out of bed did tumble. The German lad was raving mad. How he did groan and grumble! He cried to Vic, I've cut my stick. To St. Petersburg go right slap. When Vic, 'tis said, jumped out of bed and whopped him with her nightcap. We'll send him home and make him groan. Oh, Al, you've played the deuce then. The German lad has acted sad and turned tail with the Russians. From Lovely Albert, a broadside preserved at the British Museum. End of note. At last the wildest rumours began to spread. In January 1854 it was whispered that the Prince had been seized, that he had been found guilty of high treason, that he was to be committed to the Tower. The Queen herself, some declared, had been arrested, and large crowds actually collected round the Tower to watch the incarceration of the royal miscreants. Note: "You jolly Turks now go to work and show the Bear your power. It is rumoured over Britain's Isle that A is in the Tower. The postman some suspicion had, and opened the 2 letters. 'Twas pity sad the German lad should not have known much better. Lovely Albert." End of note. These fantastic hallucinations, the result of the fevered atmosphere of approaching war, were devoid of any basis in actual fact. Palmerston's resignation had been in all probability totally disconnected with foreign policy. It had certainly been entirely spontaneous, and had surprised the Court as much as the nation. Nor had Albert's influence been used in any way to favour the interests of Russia. As often happens in such cases, the Government had been swinging backwards and forwards between 2 incompatible policies, that of non-interference and that of threats supported by force, either of which, if consistently followed, might well have had a successful and peaceful issue, but which, mingled together, could only lead to war. Albert, with characteristic scrupulosity, attempted to thread his way through the complicated labyrinth of European diplomacy, and eventually was lost in the maze. But so was the whole of the Cabinet, and when war came, his anti-Russian feelings were quite as vehement as those of the most bellicose of Englishmen. Nevertheless, though the specific charges levelled against the Prince were without foundation, there were underlying elements in the situation which explained, if they did not justify, the popular state of mind. It was true that the Queen's husband was a foreigner, who had been brought up in a foreign court, was impregnated with foreign ideas, and was closely related to a multitude of foreign princes. Clearly this, though perhaps an unavoidable, was an undesirable state of affairs. Nor were the objections to it merely theoretical. It had in fact produced unpleasant consequences of a serious kind. The Prince's German proclivities were perpetually lamented by English ministers. Lord Palmerston, Lord Clarendon, Lord Aberdeen, all told the same tale, and it was constantly necessary, in grave questions of national policy, to combat the prepossessions of a court in which German views and German sentiments held a disproportionate place. As for Palmerston, his language on this topic was apt to be unbridled. At the height of his annoyance over his resignation, he roundly declared that he had been made a victim to foreign intrigue. He afterwards toned down this accusation, but the mere fact that such a suggestion from such a quarter was possible at all showed to what unfortunate consequences Albert's foreign birth and foreign upbringing might lead. But this was not all. A constitutional question of the most profound importance was raised by the position of the Prince in England. His presence gave a new prominence to an old problem, the precise definition of the functions and the powers of the Crown. Those functions and powers had become in effect his, and what sort of use was he making of them? His views as to the place of the Crown in the Constitution are easily ascertainable, for they were Stockmar's, and it happens that we possess a detailed account of Stockmar's opinions upon the subject in a long letter addressed by him to the Prince at the time of this very crisis, just before the outbreak of the Crimean War. Constitutional monarchy, according to the Baron, had suffered an eclipse since the passing of the Reform Bill. It was now constantly in danger of becoming a pure ministerial government. The old race of Tories, who had a direct interest in upholding the prerogatives of the Crown, had died out, and the Whigs were nothing but partly conscious, partly unconscious republicans, who stand in the same relation to the throne as the wolf does to the lamb. There was a rule that it was unconstitutional to introduce the name and person of the irresponsible sovereign into parliamentary debates on constitutional matters. This was a constitutional fiction, which, although undoubtedly of old standing, was fraught with danger, and the Baron